Hello, Foreign Entanglements viewers. My name is Dr. Rob Farley. I work at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce at the University of Kentucky. With me today is Dr. Adam Lowther, and we're going to talk about all things Air Force. How are you doing today, Adam?
Great, great. Good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Cool. Could you introduce yourself to the viewers?
So I'm Adam Lowther. I'm a research professor at the Air Force Research Institute, which serves as the think tank for the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And we're based at Maxwell Air Force Base, which is home to Air University, the Air Force's School of Graduate Education. So we have the Air War College, the Air Command and Staff College, and a variety of other programs.
So first, thanks for joining me. I think that a lot of Foreign Entanglements viewers are probably familiar with, I wrote a book and I argue against the independence of the Air Force. If people are interested, Adam and I have had a back and forth about this, mostly in the pages, or also the web pages of the National Interest. And we'll have links below that so you can take a look at, I think there are two of mine and two of yours, and really actually long essays responding to each other. So I guess to start off with, and I don't know whether we should start with a brief for the prosecution or the defense, but for you, what's at stake in this question of whether or not there should be an independent Air Force?
Well, I guess as I think about the nature of what an independent Air Force is, I guess I've had some discussions here lately about what is it that the Air Force does that is different from the other services, and not just what does it do, but how does it do things that make it irreplaceable.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more than just assets and airframes.
Right.
And to me, the critical thing is the command and control of air power, and the notion of how airmen think about air power and how to utilize air power. And it's distinctly different from how. So I started my career in the Navy.
Mm-hmm.
And so having spent the first 8 years in the Navy, I have some understanding of how the Navy thinks about air assets. And then I did a deployment to Iraq with some Marines. And so I have a sense of how they think about air power, and then how the Army thinks about air assets. And so for the Air Force, the notion of how you have essentially centralized control and decentralized execution, vice using, in the case of the Army, air power at the control of battalion commanders for the purpose of supporting, a battalion of ground troops. And then for, in the sense of the Navy, it's primarily for the purpose of defending the fleet, and then, raiding missions. When the Navy attacks the shore, that's effectively a raiding mission.
Mm-hmm.
So the notion of theater air superiority, the notion of how do you more effectively employ air assets over large ranges and spaces, the notion of how airmen see distance, range, and speed.
Mm-hmm.
They're very different from how the other services see it. And so to me, it's really that notion of how it's employed, how air assets and air power is employed, that makes the Air Force distinctly different. And if you were to, just as I think you suggest, to take the air assets, the airframes of the Air Force, and disperse them to the other services, it's that you would lose that ability to efficiently allocate air power, in a combat theater.
Right, and you're familiar. You're very familiar, I think, with where I'm coming from with respect to this. I don't know if you've read the book or you're going to, but you know the argument. So, I am not impressed by the performance of the independent Air Force as a service, either sort of as a political unit or as a warfighting unit. And I think this gets to some of the points you just made, right, where we sort of take a look and we compare, how this service, which is designed to foment a sense of air-mindedness, and air-mindedness is a term that Colin Gray uses a lot, but a lot of people use it. And I mean, I look at the performance of the Army Air Force in World War II, and I think it compares very favorably with the performance of the Air Force in Korea. I think it compares very favorably with the performance of the independent Air Force in Vietnam. Certainly the Air Force has done better in easier conflicts since then, in conflicts where the United States had overwhelming advantage, regardless of how we had structured our military services. But I realize I'm getting historical here, but we should be able to think about this historically and think about whether the historical record suggests that the independent Air Force actually leads to a more efficient employment of air power. And so I look at Korea, where General LeMay refuses to allow his B-36s to be used against Korea because he knows the engines are going to burn out on the way home, and where B-29 formations are cut to pieces by MiG-15s, which are being flown by the North Koreans and the Chinese. And in Vietnam, where we're incapable of putting up an interceptor that can fight the MiG-21s and the MiG-17s that the North Vietnamese are putting up, and where Navy flyers consistently outperform Air Force flyers in dogfighting, just simply because of the training, because the training is much better in the Navy, and the formation flying is much better in the Navy. And so from an evidentiary basis, it's hard for me to accept the argument that there is considerable value added, at least in terms of developing a more formidable, more lethal way of using air power through having an independent Air Force.
Yeah, I guess let's take the Army Air Forces. I mean, this is really the first opportunity in which, under Hap Arnold and under the other TUI spots and LeMay and other leadership, mm-hmm. that the Air Forces were essentially effectively independent mm-hmm. of ground forces. I mean, granted, they provided close air support, but the bombing missions, for example, were wholly independent of, the land commanders. Mm-hmm. And then so when the Air Force becomes independent in the years immediately following World War II, I mean, think about the notion of the Air Force celebrated its, the 70th anniversary here recently. So if you think about the Army or the Navy,
I think 75, it was 75 2 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, so the Army has been around for, armies have been around for thousands of years. The U.S. Army is mm-hmm. 200 plus years old and, 300 years old. Whereas the Air Force is a relatively new thing that has not only gained independence in the last, 75 years, but has only been able to accomplish a variety of missions as the technology has developed. So the technology isn't 75 years old. So I guess part of it is just to say that the Air Force has gotten better over time as it has developed the techniques, training, procedures, the capabilities. So when you say, well, the air power did better early on, and I guess my point would just be to say that air power has developed over those preceding, those decades that came after World War II and after Korea and after Vietnam, and that the reason that you have such dominant air power today, I mean, of course, everybody says, yeah, wars are easy for the Air Force. I mean, nobody can touch us. And my point is, yeah, and the reason is because the independent Air Force has looked at the utilization of air power in such a way as that it was able to develop a set of capabilities that nobody could touch, and that would have never been the case. So this is a counterfactual, but that, absent the Air Force being there to advocate for those capabilities and to develop a mindset that said, okay, now here's how we should employ air power, that you wouldn't have that. So, for example, when it comes to bombers,
Mhm.
historically, the biggest opponent of the bomber force has always been the Navy because they were fearful that bombers would replace, battleships and carriers because they had such long range. And so, if you didn't have an Air Force, you wouldn't have a bomber force because they would have always opposed it, as they always historically have. The Army has taken a
Well, I
similar.
mean, if I could please pause for a second there. We did not have an independent Air Force prior to World War II, right? Air power was part of the United States Army. It was the Army Air Service, the Army Air Corps, and then the Army Air Force. Um, and actually, I mean, I think that the Army allowed the Army Air Corps to over-focus on bomber aviation at the expense of pursuit aviation and the expense of attack aviation. But I mean, it's a bit of a strain to me to suggest that we wouldn't have a bomber force, right? I mean, the Soviet Air Force the Soviet Air Forces were always subservient to the Red Army, and they nevertheless had a significant bomber force. I mean, we can argue about how independent the Chinese Air Force is right now, but it certainly wasn't independent 10 or 15 years ago, and they had a bigger bomber force than they do now. Um, so I mean, I guess that's one way of responding. That look, we do have examples of armies that have aviation corps that develop long-range aviation, um, and two, and this goes back to sort of one of your comments, and this was from the latest or from your last piece, and again we'll link to this. Um, if we hadn't built all those bombers, that I wanted to stand up and cheer when I read that view because that's great, right? I mean, if we had built the USS United States in 1949 instead of B-36s, that would have saved us so much money. If we had not built the B-58, that would have been great. If we hadn't poured money into the B-70, that would have been great. These would have been good choices with respect to the history of sort of U.S. defense procurement. Although I appreciate you're not going to agree with that, but I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Well, I guess it's like any, like any technological system. I mean, you can think of automobiles that, Americans have bought where they can look back historically and say, well, geez, I wish I wouldn't have bought that Chevette.
Right.
Or I wish I wouldn't have bought that Fiat, or I wish I would. But,
There's a Nissan Sentra in my case that I really just wish I had not bought. But yeah,
yeah. And so, that's the notion of the development of air power, is that you have a lot of, and this is, to me, I think the problem with modern air power is that we don't have those aircrafts. And what I mean by that is we're so focused now on ensuring that we have that one silver bullet, which for us now is it's our one aircraft, one fighter multi-purpose aircraft that we're building in the
right.
United States. And so we never go through those stages of having these other aircraft that are not the silver bullet. And to me, that's more the problem than having aircraft that are not, magic weapons.
Right.
So I'm willing to accept LeMay's desire for a nuclear powered bomber, and I'm willing to accept, all sorts of.
It was a great idea. It would be flying around for weeks, right? The crew would never get agitated in doing that. But it's such an interesting idea. LeMay is such a fascinating figure.
Yeah, and so I think you have to take the Air Force. I guess part of my critique of some of your work, it would be just that it looks at the very early days of the Air Force, and in many respects the Air Force, because of its youth and its technological nature, that it's the more recent history that I think is the most relevant, because what happened, whereas the Navy, for example, I was at a Navy conference not too long ago, and somebody had written in kind of like under the banner of the conference title, they had written 200 years without change, because the Navy just doesn't change.
Yeah, that's not ideal.
And so, whereas the Air Force is in constant change and flux because of its nature and because of just what it is. And so whenever I read somebody, read something that talks about, the Air Force from, say, Vietnam or before, I have to be honest, I really don't care because it's almost irrelevant to the modern Air Force and its application of air power today and in the future.
Right, so let me try a different tack. And I know you and I argued a little bit about this with respect to, and it does get back to the penny packets argument that's really commonly made, but with respect to sort of why the Air Force was founded in the first place. And, there are different arguments historians make, one of which is that sort of people came to an understanding of the need for a centralized air commander in campaigns, and they came to this understanding in 41, 42, and 43. And then there's the argument, which I tend to be more of a partisan of, which was that strategic air power, the combined bomber offensive, the bomber offensive against Japan, were sort of really central to the Air Force's case for strategic air power. But sort of just setting that aside for a second, I guess. And did you read Ben Lambeth's Air-Land Reversal? Where he made the argument that most of the destruction is now caused by air forces rather than ground forces, even in campaigns like Cobra 2 and Desert Storm and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I've read a good bit of stuff, but I can't recall if I've read that specifically.
Right. So I guess an argument that I would make is that your Air Force after 1972, which is at this period post-Vietnam, when you have the development of Red Flag, which is synonymous with the rise of the fighter generals, which is just a classic text on the early history and sort of the middle history of the Air Force. That in fact that you're right, that after 1972 the Air Force gets much better at what it does, right? That from my point of view, it sort of sets aside the World War II strategic generals, sets not completely aside, but no longer prioritizes strategic air power and focuses more on tactical air power. But in doing that, and I'm not the first person to make this argument, right? People in the Air Force, including I think even John Warden, have sort of made this argument that in doing that, it sort of undercuts its own reason for being, right? I mean, and the argument would be that you look at Desert Storm in 1991, and this looks like a campaign that could have been effectively waged by an Army Air Corps that had focused on interdiction, close air support, that had focused on fighter bombers, that did not focus on strategic aviation, did not focus on sort of effects-based operations, that this looks like the sort of force that the Army could really come up with on its own, right? That it didn't need the Air Force to come up with what was essentially a tactical Air Force that had its strategic effect by destroying the Iraqi army in the desert, or at least by facilitating the destruction of the Iraqi army in the desert. And that you have this again in 2001, and again in 2003, and again even in 2011, where the primary strategic effect of the Air Force is not long-range strike for effect, but rather the close destruction and even the mid-range destruction of field and enemy forces. And if you buy that, Billy Mitchell, Hap Arnold, the whole lot of them would not find that a compelling logic for an independent Air Force. They would see that as a compelling logic for an Air Force that remained part of the Army.
I see what you're saying, but I think it's it's a look at the platforms. It's a platform centric approach and what I guess I would say is that so if these assets were in the Army Air Corps or the Army Air Forces, whatever we would decide to call it, they never would have engaged. And they never would have had the air doctrine that would have sent them to perform those specific missions. Because if you look at Army air doctrine today and historically, what air power did, even if it is tactical fighters, the Army would not have the doctrine and would not have the mission planning and would not have the approach to the enemy that would have had it go and wage the campaign that ultimately, the air campaign that ultimately allowed ground forces to wage a 6-day war.
Mm-hmm.
The Army wouldn't have thought about air in that way. And this goes back to my take on what is command and control, and what is that notion of how do you employ air power.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's not just the airframes, because the Air Force has tactical airframes that don't fly 7,000 miles, but it's how do you employ them. I think that's really the most important thing. And so when you look at Desert Storm, so if you go back to Dave Deptula and Worden, who designed the air campaign, that was not something that the Army was an advocate of. The Army didn't say, oh, yeah, this makes sense. We should definitely do this. The Army didn't buy it. They wanted to go heavy, and they didn't see the utility of air power.
Well, part of the Air Force didn't buy it either. I mean, it wasn't the final plan that was executed really doesn't resemble Worden's initial plan hardly at all, right? I mean, Worden was pretty clear, and there were people in the Air Force who were pretty excited by this idea of, launching a strikes primarily oriented at the interior two rings, right? At Saddam Hussein's leadership and at command and control. And Worden argued that if we do this, we can have it over in 2 weeks, and we shouldn't attack the Iraqi army at all because we'll need them to go back and occupy Iraq after the end. And Bob Horner shut him down, and other people within the Air Force shut him down. So you're right that it didn't get quite to the army, but Worden's strategic air campaign sort of never came through, at least as Worden wanted to envision it.
That's in part true. I mean, if you look at the initial campaign, it was targeted, at central regime targets. And then, for example, at the end, I mean, when we have, the highway of death,
mm-hmm.
I mean, that was just in many respects gratuitous violence. And so I think the war.
Let me actually pause you on that. It was gratuitous violence, and I want to, for any viewers, there's no compelling logic I've ever seen to say that it was illegal, right? That it was sort of outside legal war. It was Iraqi forces in retreat. You can attack forces in retreat by sort of any, as long as they're not surrendering, as long as the war isn't ending, you can attack enemy forces in retreat. I've had this argument with other people in the past, not with you, but I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, I mean, so the war was well over by that point, and the ability of the regime to command forces had already been destroyed. So, I think the fundamental nature of what Worden and what Deptula really sought to do, actually, it worked. And then if you look at, Iraq War II, I mean, Iraq War II, people talk about 2001, and they talk about, the pincer, and they talk about how U.S. ground forces came in. And it's kind of like, well, geez, guys, you seem to be forgetting that when the ground troops went home, air power stayed with Northern Watch and Southern Watch, and air power never left. And so by the time ground troops came back, a decade later, the Air Force had effectively disabled much of the Iraqi military's ability to, put aircraft in the air, to operate its radars, to, they had essentially season the battlefield to the point that it was relatively easy for ground troops to invade the country. And you have to give credit to air power for that. And had we been the Army Air Corps, that would have never happened either.
I mean, I guess there are 2 points I would push back a little bit on. One is I think the Iraqis in 1991 actually did come up with far more robust communications techniques and technologies than we were sort of capable of destroying, which is why their heavy units maneuvered. They retreated and they maneuvered in front of our heavy units. And so, I mean, Saddam Hussein was able to continue to communicate with his forces even deep into the battle. And I guess, I find it difficult to believe that any Army Air Corps, at least that I'm envisioning, is not going to be able to maintain, fairly low intensity patrols over a fairly small country with an air defense network that's been nearly obliterated and that's under, crushing military and civilian economic sanctions. Um, and so, I guess that's again, we're sort of to this point of how difficult of a thing are you suggesting that the Air Force needs to accomplish. We should also say the Navy also participated in both of those, and the British also participated with their own independent Air Force. I'll grant, also participated in both of those campaigns. So, and I guess another thing would be some people would argue that it didn't solve the strategic problem with Saddam Hussein, right? That we still, in the end, people felt the need to invade in 2003 with ground forces, although there's no question that the Air Force performed extremely effectively against the Iraqi army in 2003. So,
well, I mean, we had solved the strategic problem in 1991.
mm-hmm.
The strategic problem was solved, but there was a political problem that hadn't been solved that
right.
was addressed 10 years later. But that's kind of a whole other ball of wax. But go for it.
Well, what would you say? What would you say is the most important thing that the Air Force does that I just don't get? Like, and I know you've sort of suggested, at other times that I don't have quite the perspective, and you may be right about that. But on a day-to-day basis of how to make the Defense Department function, like what does the Air Force do that's basically irreplaceable?
Oh, well, I mean, it's command and control of air
Mm-hmm.
power. So, the Air Force is the JFAC in all of the COCOMs. The JFAC is always an airman.
Mm-hmm.
And the Navy tried to build its own C2 networking capability. So both the technology and the practices of how to command and control joint air power.
Mm-hmm.
And it ultimately gave up because it just couldn't figure out how to build a C2 network for air power. And ultimately, it was really kind of a good thing for the Air Force because the Navy walked away from it. And this was here in the last, less than a decade.
Mm-hmm.
The Navy walked away and said, yeah, you guys do this and you do it really well, and we can't replace it.
Right.
And so, I think
that's the most common answer people give me, like people who really know their stuff give me. So, I mean, that's.
And to me, that's really, my personal take is, and this is something that I think it's really hard to appreciate. Now, I'm not sure I even really fundamentally appreciate the nature and the role of command and control of air power.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure that absent really spending a lot of time, for you and me, neither of us were Air Force or Navy pilots.
Right.
And so there's a lack of perspective that, we both have where we're sitting here as scholars to try to think about these big strategic questions where, it's hard to really fundamentally understand it absent, any experience having done it. And so one of the things I would say is spending time in a CAOC,
mm-hmm.
where you actually see how air power.
Can we? A lot of people aren't going to know the acronym.
The Combined Air Operations Center.
Mm-hmm.
So the place, so Al Udeid, for example, is where the CAOC and for CENTCOM and for the wars in
mm-hmm.
Afghanistan and Iraq, and there are CAOCs elsewhere around the world where the Air Force would command air power for whatever region. And so I think it's and it's it's a lot of working parts. So it's not just the F-22s or
right.
the F-35s or whatever. It's okay. Well, now, what is the logistics network that we're going to need to put F-16s in the Philippines, and the aerial refueling capabilities, and the heavy lift, and the what kind of you got to have AWACS up, and you got to have JSTARS, and you got to have your space-based networks that are providing, ISR and that full platform of capabilities, like the
Hmm.
space capabilities. So, from a historical perspective, much of the space assets that we have are ones that the Army absolutely did not want,
Hmm.
and that they fought against, and that the Air Force, by virtue of its ability to be an independent service, and this is kind of it gives you parity in the the money fight. So whenever people talk about the golden mean, where the Army gets 27.5% and the Navy gets 27.5 and the Air Force gets 27.5 and then DoD agencies get that other
Right.
12 or 13%.
Right.
Absent the Air Force being there, many of those things would have never been developed, because fundamentally the Army is about, you find, fix, and finish an adversary on the ground. And it's that mindset that you can't just throw some guys in there. And this is Billy Mitchell and other airmen in the Army,
Hmm.
that there's a weight of numbers and a weight of you know strength within the service, that if you're not the biggest guy in the service, you just don't win. And so, and I see it even in, you see it in the other services. You see it, for example, in the Army, there
Hmm.
are, the combat arms control the Army, whereas the non-combat arms groups, they don't control the Army. And within the Air Force, rated guys control the Air Force, flyers control the Air Force. And so there's a lot of other guys, the logisticians and the maintenance guys, and that are, equally capable, equally good, but, they're not the guy in charge, and they're not the purpose of the service. And so when you're not the purpose of the service, then you're ultimately, going to play second fiddle.
Right. I mean, I guess one of my questions is, if sort of the biggest part of what the Air Force does in terms of facilitation, right, in space, in terms of command and control, in terms of logistics, and making air power happen, and making the other two services capable of doing what they want to do on a day-to-day basis. If those guys are already second fiddle in the Air Force, and most people seem to think they are, um, what's the difference between having them second fiddle in the Air Force and having them second fiddle in the Army, right? That you know, it strikes me that Army people are smart. Army people and Navy people are going to understand the need for space-based capabilities. They're going to understand the need for human capital to make their GPS work. They're going to understand that they need satellites, right? I mean, the Army was developing ICBMs before the Air Force was. The Air Force took them over, but the Army was developing space capabilities just like the Navy was. And in other countries, in China, right? I mean, you have a fight over space between the Air Force and the Second Artillery. Um, I mean, a lot of this seems to me to be, the outcome of modernization in what is certainly the largest military in the world, but what you would expect any set of military institutions to do, and that's not dependent on the particular configuration we're looking at. Right? The configuration, the constellation of services that we have right now, especially one that has the Air Force in it and has the Air Force sort of prime place in it.
Yeah, I mean, just from my own experience, kind of being involved and watching and participating in some of these
Mhm.
fights, and I guess I would just say that uh, it wouldn't inherently get designed, and it wouldn't inherently, these capabilities we've talked about
Mhm.
wouldn't necessarily get built, or they might not be as robust, they might not be as, so you would still have space,
Mhm.
but it sure wouldn't look like what it does today. And you would have airframes, but you sure wouldn't have the capabilities you do today. So it's not to say that they would completely disappear,
Mhm.
but they sure wouldn't have the capabilities they do. And just from being there to watch it and to write about it and to advocate for certain groups as
Mhm.
opposed to others, I can see that uh, being a major player is really, really helpful.
Right.
And if you don't have a dog in that fight, because, so I deal with the French Air Force,
Hmm.
and the French Air Force has in many respects moved in the direction you would advocate. So they have become increasingly subservient to the Army as the French have cut their defense budgets.
Hmm.
And if you look at their capabilities, um, I mean, even for a country, I mean, it's really kind of a preeminent country in Europe, and it's a big country. I mean, they've got 70 million, 75 million people. They've got one of the 10 largest GDPs in the world, so they're a big country.
One of the top 10 defense budgets in the world. I mean, an impressive military establishment, but one that's declining in size.
But their Air Force is really taking it on the chin, and they just don't have the capabilities, and nor do they have the ability to advocate for the capabilities, because in that inter-service fight,
Hmm.
they're just not, they're really not an effective player. And so I guess I would just say that when you're positioned to be something other than an equal, you can expect what being something other than an equal will bring. And that something else is, you know, a lot less, a
Right.
lot less capability, a lot less power, a lot less ability to influence outcomes, a lot less of a lot of things.
Right. Um, I guess one more question, then. Well, then we'll see if we can talk a little bit about Ukraine. You wrote in one of your pieces, and we talked a little bit about cyber and space here. You at least mused, and I think Colin Gray has also mused about the potential for an independent cyber force. Maybe one day an independent space force.
Mhm.
Um, is there what is the sort of, even using the argument you just used? What is the logic for the difference in the logic between having an independent air force and having an independent submarine force? Right. Submarine force operates, trains largely independently from the service navy. It has a culture that's much different than the service navy. It's expected to do much different things than the service navy. Um, I guess if you were trying to explain to me, this is why we have an air force, and this is, I mean, is it, I guess, that the air force does sort of play this larger cerebral, has this larger cerebral vision of how air power affects everything, and submarines, no matter how much distinct they may be, really do have a much smaller part of defense.
Well, I
Or
guess for me, I mean, you could make the same argument. Well, why shouldn't naval aviation be separate? Because it's
mhm,
distinctly different from, the submarine navy or the
mhm,
surface navy. So Airedale's, I was a surface guy.
mhm,
Airedale's surface guys and submariners all think differently.
right,
They all think that they're better than the other two. I mean, and clearly the surface is the best. I guess it's just that for submariners and for surface guys and for Airedales, Navy aviation, they all think that they're different and better than the other branches of the Navy, but
mhm,
really they do have a very strong commonality, and that is they operate, above, on, or below the water.
mhm,
And so, when it comes to, submariners, it's really not the submarine force that operates independently as much as it is the nuclear submarine force that
mhm,
is, in many respects, quite autonomous because the attack subs, so whenever I was working with the
right,
Teddy Roosevelt Battle Group and we would have submarines that would deploy with us, and they were attack subs. So, they're fairly well integrated, the surface, the air, and the submarine forces. It's really just the nuclear fleet that's
the boomer fleet.
yeah, that's autonomous.
Right.
But that it's that common domain. So whenever I talk about, that we're going to reach a point where we need an independent space force and an independent cyber force, for me, there are physical domains. And when you can master and deliver kinetic effects through the physical domain, that's the point at which, you need to look at an independent service, because you as the group that operates in that domain will see and understand that domain in very different ways than those who operate in other domains. I mean, sailors see water very differently than airmen do,
Right.
and very differently than soldiers do. It's a very different perspective. And so cyber guys, so we do a lot of work on cyber and how to build a cyber force and things of that nature. And so as I have these discussions with real hardcore techie cyber guys, and we talk about simple things like what is cyberspace and what is the nature of it. I mean, just some of their discussion of it, I'm like thinking, well, geez, what are these guys talking about? What are they really?
Right.
It's just that different. And space as a domain is really right now. It's just it's a transit point for communications,
Mm-hmm.
and it provides a place for an observation platform, but it really doesn't deliver kinetic effects. So therefore, it's not mature enough, or the capabilities are not mature enough to warrant it being an independent service. And so for me, I actually think cyber will be there before space is,
Well, that's
and in
interesting.
part because of the treaties.
Right, and you can also imagine a cyber force that would have distinct training and recruiting and training requirements that would be distinct from the other services. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Right. Last quick point. If you were to say, what does air power more generally, or sort of the institutional independent air force, and it doesn't have to solve the problem, but what does an air force do? What does it offer a president, a policymaker, in the context of a crisis like we're facing right now in Ukraine and Crimea? Right? Is there, which is not to say we want to go and shoot down the Russian Air Force, right? But when the president's looking for answers, sort of what does having an air power oriented service, how does that matter for the answers that are given to he or she?
Well, I think the number one thing that comes to mind is clearly the strategic nuclear deterrent. Both the ICBM force and the bomber force as visible means of giving a guy like Vladimir Putin pause
Mm-hmm.
to contemplate where are America's red lines and when have I gone too far, and to hopefully give him a reason to think twice about further annexation of the Ukraine or Belarus or these other places he may have his Armenia, Georgia, and then secondly, I mean, take the F-22 for example. I mean, it has no peers. So if Russian air power were to get antsy and to see, for example, they invade the airspace of other countries, then you would have the capability to shoot it down as a very clear signal of American resolve. So you can use air power to signal resolve, and you can do some other interesting things that effectively tell a guy like Putin what America is capable and willing to do. And if you think about it, I mean, think about China and Russia. They have dramatically reduced the sizes of their ground forces. They are working distinctly on their naval and air forces and bringing them up to speed.
Mm-hmm.
And so they clearly understand that the battle is in the air, and they understand where that is where America's greatest advantage is. And so I guess, right now we have that advantage. And so it would be the thing that we would want to use to both deter Russia and then to begin to push Russia back, depending upon how they were, how aggressive they got.
Right. If there were some sort of similar Russia incursion into a NATO country like one of the Baltic states or something along those lines, right, we would imagine air power being the first responder. Right. It seems without question. Well, Adam, thank you very much for joining us here today. This has been a fantastic conversation, and hopefully we can have another one sometime soon. And I have to say, what's that?
I was just going to say thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, and I have to say, again, you're a Sun Devil fan. I am a Duck. And so that's why the little bit of hostility towards Arizona State. But go Ducks! They're playing tomorrow. I don't know when Arizona State plays, but
tomorrow at 8:30.
Oh, tomorrow 8:30 tomorrow night.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, for Pac-10 solidarity in the tournament, I guess I'll say go Sun Devils at least for the first round. So.
All right. Well, thanks very much. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining me.